Steve Jobs is a name the tech industry is yet to forget, a visionary leader who changed the very concept of product design.
If you look at people in the world today, some are great at technology, like Bill Gates. Some are great at the arts, whether it's, Bono or the Beatles. But Steve Jobs could appreciate both camps.
He was a passionate public speaker, a charismatic, enthusiastic fella who could hold the attention of his audience in the palm of his hands. But what type of leader was he? Why was he seen as a manipulative, demanding boss who often humiliated his employees and partners? This is a story that unveils Steve Jobs' ruthless leadership and the dark price of innovation. The early days. Back in the day, before the world knew the name Apple, iPhone, MacBook, or even Macintosh, there were two dreamers with a vision that would force Steve down the dark path he was forced to walk. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. The popular story of Steve Jobs started the way most tech giants in the 1970s started. A college kid in a garage is sitting across his partner in crime, dreaming big dreams over near-empty coffee mugs. They would set out on the adventure, sailing from dreaming to doing, facing rejection, failure, and character development struggles. There would be times when the whole world is against them, but each setback would fuel their determination to reach their goal and become
legendary.
And the partner in crime in Steve Jobs' story is none other than Woz, aka Steve Wozniak.
Steve Jobs came by, and I would have been too shy to go meet him. But he came by and we started talking, and sure enough, we hit it off.
They did more than just hit it off. They combined their different intellects to launch the very first Apple that wasn't as sleek and shiny as what we know now. Yet, it sat as a testament to their vision, a starting point to later empower individuals. But that was as far as their similarities went. Wozniak was a socially awkward teenager, while Jobs was the exact opposite. Wozniak was a hobbyist who believed information and designs should be free, so he designed schematics and electronic systems for friends and family, while Jobs was the kind of guy who wouldn't even give his sister a 10% discount.
I got a call one day in later days, and it was from Steve Jobs' sister, and her computer was going bad. It had been too many years, and she had asked Steve, her brother, for a 10% discount, and he wouldn't give just a discount. He wouldn't give it to her.
I'm sorry, but there is no defending that. That makes Jobs a first-rate a-hole. To be like that to your own sister when you make and create the product that you could easily give her for free and not even worry about or buy for her without batting an eye. Unreal. It sure was unreal. Even his friend for years was shocked out of his mind.
That was just shocking.
However, that seemingly unlikely partnership led to the creation of the Apple brand and the Apple company. With a company came employees, and with employees came a different set of problems. The perfect project.
We wanted people that were insanely great at what they did, who had at the tips of their fingers and in their passion the latest understanding of where technology was and what we could do with that technology.
The process of being hired by Apple was so rigorous in the beginning. It took both the capacity to be the best and that little added spice.
A new interviewee would talk to everybody in the building at least once and maybe a couple times and then come back for another round of interviews, and then we'd all get together and talk about it.
But the strain of that hiring process was just the beginning. Steve Jobs had a reputation within the company as a ruthless leader, both in managing people and in business. It's a known fact that he cheated his best friend and partner in the early days of their journey to stardom. He consistently demanded the impossible from his team, forcing them to make late hours at neck-breaking speed to hit deadlines that were downright insane sometimes, and getting into fits of rage and tantrums whenever things weren't going his way. Steve Jobs was prone to yelling at employees and even board members for their bozo ideas, or tarnishing Apple's reputation.
Most of them were bozos.
He put employees in teams that worked on competing products, which could leave one team jobless and another victorious. If the employee failed to meet deadlines, they were bozos, but if they succeeded, then what stopped him from taking credit for the idea? He was the leader that pushed them to become their best selves, and after years of twisting and bending reality to suit his dream and narrative, those around him started calling it reality distortion. So the more one dove into Steve Jobs and Apple's leadership, the more it looked like a gladiator pit that forced intellectuals to battle it out for their very survivability. But not everybody agrees with that conclusion. People have the impression that Steve Jobs was an autocratic leader who preferred to do things himself rather than allow his teammates to think for him. People also think that Steve Jobs was a perfectionist, But I think that his perfectionism was the good type that did Apple well. He was also pretty demanding, but that was the only way to ensure that Apple's standards were sky high. Overall, he was a pretty successful leader, and while his leadership style was slightly strict, it was useful to Apple. Although his success is undeniable today, it all came at a heavy cost. A cost that was carried by others, employees, wives, sons, daughters, every other person aside from the co-founder of Apple himself.
I lost my wife in that process. I lost my children in that process. I lost the whole structure of my life was just changed forever by going and working on the Mac.
At the end of the day, with an insanely toxic environment that took everything from the employees, leaving them with no time or energy for anything else, it was natural that families would fall apart. But the lives of Apple's direct employees weren't the only thing falling apart. The lives of its contracted staffs were also on the line, and many of them lost it. Foxconn deaths. Many Apple products are manufactured by an electronic company based in Taiwan called Foxconn, with factories based in China. Cheap labor in China is a known fact. What is rarely known is the suicide rate among frontline workers tasked with assembling the iPhones and iPads that consumers can't get enough of. The average life of such an employee is working 10 to 12-hour shifts daily, with a lunch hour and a couple of brief 10-minute breaks, standing on an assembly line and performing the same task over and over again. In such a high-pressure environment, claims were brought to Apple with the BBC documentary and undercover reporters who reported on the prison-like concentration camps that produced their devices. Prison camps were supposed to be contrary to Steve Jobs' noble dream of empowering all who touch the iPhone. The report shared 15 Foxconn employees who chose to take their lives rather than continue living in helplessness. And what was Apple's response?
Do you have any comments on what's going on at Foxconn?
Foxconn is not a sweatshop. It's a factory, but my gosh, I mean, they've got restaurants and movie theaters and hospitals and swimming pools, and I mean, for a factory, it's a pretty nice factory.
He went further to compare the suicide rates in the factory to that of the whole United States and concluded that it's troubling, but they were on it.
And you all are bringing in psychiatrists or any?
We're trying to understand right now.
But people weren't buying it. Steve Jobs actually looked like he was struggling with his lies during the last moments of the video. Jobs is very good at speaking well, speaking what can be spoken and no speaking what cannot. You can tell he's hiding a lot, and he's giving just enough to satisfy the inquirer. Seems too extensive to easily hide from an Apple inspector if they visited these facilities. Even if the visit is announced, which they shouldn't be if they really cared, how could the plant managers roll this all back to the appropriate standards even for just a one-day show? I respect the Chinese people's ability to come together and execute impressive feats, both willingly and by force, but just seems too much to hide if Apple really looked and cared. Foxconn is not a sweatshop, LOL. And with time, other horrible reports started coming in, like this report by Business Insider Africa that read, Apple knew a supplier was using child labor but took 3 years to fully cut ties, despite the company's promises to hold itself to the highest standards. While The Verge reported, former employees say Apple stood by while suppliers violated Chinese labor laws. This then begged the question. If Steve Jobs was known to be cruel to his direct employees, forcing them to work horrible hours and compete to survive, why would he care about how others treated their workers? If Steve Jobs had responsibility for his actions, what role does the consumer play in all this? After all, our desire for pretty things sure gave him at least some of the power he needed to do as he pleased. Even as a manipulative, demanding boss, Steve Jobs was a visionary whose innovation came at a heavy cost. A cost paid across continents with stories of lives lost. And this story shows the dark side of Steve Jobs' ruthless leadership.